And so tonight we're going to begin our study this quarter. We're going to cover three of the minor prophets, including Hosea, Joel, and Amos. So tonight we're going to begin with Hosea. And here's the thing. It's going to be a challenge to get through three of these in a quarter. There's a lot of material to cover, a lot to talk about. So we're going to do our best to push through and get through as much of it as we can. What that means is we're not going to be able to talk in depth about maybe everything that we would really want to talk about. So I do want to tell you that if we don't talk about something as much as you would like to, or we don't cover something, you still have questions about it, let me know. We'll go back and we'll revisit some of it. But like I said, we're going to have to skip over and kind of fly through some of this stuff if we're going to cover all three of these prophets this quarter. So let me know. We'll go back and we'll revisit it, and we'll cover as much as we can so we can get the most out of this study together throughout this quarter. Let's begin by having a word of prayer together. Let's bow. Our Holy Father in heaven, God, we're honored to be here tonight. We're so thankful that we have the privilege of having your word and carrying it with us, having the ability to read it and to study it. We have the opportunity to look back at the history of your people and to see your great love and your guidance and your forgiveness. And we can know your power and know your care for us. God, we're thankful for your prophet Hosea, for his zeal and his desire to serve you even in a difficult time. And God, we pray that we will have the same kind of faith and courage that he had to listen to you, to be obedient to your commands, and to just be the people you'd call us to be. Be with us tonight. Help us to focus. Help us to learn. Help us to grow in our love and knowledge of you. It's through your Son's name that we pray. Amen. All right. As we get started here, let's consider for a few minutes here the date of Hosea. And we get an idea of the dating of this book really from the very beginning. In Hosea chapter 1 and verse 1, we read, "The word of the Lord came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel." Here, Hosea helps us get a little bit of a time frame of the time that he was a prophet for God by listing four of the kings of Judah that reigned during his time, as well as mentioning the king of Israel that was reigning at the time of the beginning of his ministry. While there is still some debate as to what the exact dates of his ministry were, it's thought that it's somewhere in the range of 750 to 720, 710 BC. Here we have a list of the minor prophets and the dates that they were thought to have been prophets for God. I want you to notice that as you look on the right column, there are very few who were actually prophets for the northern kingdom. There's only three of the minor prophets that were with the northern kingdom, and one of the other ones is Amos, who we'll talk about towards the end of our quarter. Who Amos and Hosea were kind of contemporaries of each other. Hosea came a little bit after Amos was a prophet for God. Here, I know this is small, it's kind of hard to see, but it kind of helps, again, put things into perspective here. If you notice up at the top where the arrow is, we have, there's pointing to Hosea, and again, his time frame. Here, these people say that it ended, instead of 710, it ended about 725 was his reign. So again, there's discrepancies, but we see this idea of kind of the time frame of when he ruled. If you look down, there we have the southern kingdom, Judah, and we have those four kings that were listed there in Hosea chapter 1 and verse 1. And we see where, again, Hosea was a prophet for God during that time. But if you keep looking down, we see a list of the northern kingdom of Israel. And what's fascinating is during that time, about a 30-year period, we see where there were 6 different kings for Israel, for the northern kingdom. We're gonna talk a little bit more about this here in just a minute. But I want you to think about this idea of there being 6 different people in leadership, in major leadership positions in such a short amount of time. You know, when we think about something like that happening in today's society, whether it's in a business or an organization or whatever it might be, usually there's chaos and things that ensue because people in leadership positions, they have different agendas. They have different ways of doing things. And so when you're constantly shifting and changing leadership at a high level, usually things aren't able to run as effectively as maybe they could if there was a sustained person in leadership. And as a result of this, we're going to see the chaos that takes place in Israel during this time. We see this turmoil in a really a very sad way, because we see the culture of Israel in a really tough spot while Hosea was a prophet. Let's think about the historical setting here of the northern kingdom of Israel during this time. In Hosea chapter 4, Hosea starts to make a shift a little bit. Chapter 4 is kind of a break in the outline of this book, and he begins to talk about the culture of Israel in this time. Notice what he has to say about Israel. In Hosea chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, he said, "Hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel. For the Lord brings a charge against the inhabitants of the land. There is no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land. By swearing and lying, killing and stealing, by committing adultery, they break all restraint with bloodshed upon bloodshed." Sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? Can you imagine what that was like? Here is God's people. And Hosea has to say that among God's people, there was no knowledge, no truth of God in that land. He says they went by and they were swearing and they were lying and they were killing and they were stealing and they were committing adultery. You can see the culture really declining. But notice this last phrase. They break all restraint with bloodshed upon bloodshed. See, here we get this image, this description of this great moral decline of the nation of Israel. And usually when we think about a culture or a society declining when it comes to morality, usually has a lot to do with leadership. When you think back over the history of God's people. When there was a good king in the nation, what happened to the people? They were good. They turned to God. They began to keep His commandments. They came back and they rebuilt and fixed up the temple. They fixed up worship to God. They turned back to Him. But what about those times when there was an evil king that was in charge of God's people? What happened? The nation went downhill when it came to their morality. They followed the leadership of that king to a point where it changed the outlook of the whole nation. See, here when Hosea described the nation as breaking all restraint with bloodshed upon bloodshed, he was talking about the leadership in that time. He's talking about the kings, those 6 kings who ruled in that 30-year period that caused this great downfall, this downgrade in the morals of the nation of Israel. Let's look at these individuals for a minute. The first king that was in rule during the time of Hosea was this man by the name of Zechariah. We see where he reigned for only 6 months, from the years 753 to 752 BC. And his reign was ended when he was murdered by a man by the name of Shallum. Can you guess who became the next king? Shallum took his place as king over Israel at that point. And Shallum only ruled for 1 month in 752 BC. And then he was murdered by a man by the name of Manaam. Again, Manaam took his place as king over Israel. And Manaam actually reigned for 10 years, from 752 to 742 BC. And what's interesting about Manaam is the big thing we read about him, the thing we understand about him, is that he paid tribute to Pul, the king of Assyria. What happened during his time was the Assyrians had come up against the nation of Israel, and they were ready to do battle with Israel. And Manaam, fear of what might happen, he went to the king and he said, let's make a deal, let's barter, let's figure out how we can work through this. And the king, King Pul of Assyria, what he said was, I will back off and we won't attack the nation if you promise to give me 1,000 talents of silver. And as a result, Manaam went back to the nation of Israel, and he went to all the people and found the wealthy people, and he convinced them to pay him so he could pay off the king of Assyria. Is this payment that he gave them held off the Assyrians for a while, but it'd be sure they had to pay this tribute to the Assyrians to hold them off. And ultimately, we're going to see this was the result of put into captivity by the Assyrians. And we'll get into that here in a little bit. So Manaam, he reigned for 10 years, and at the end of his rule, his son took his place. I don't even know how to say this guy's name. Pekahiah. Sure, we'll go with it. This other man, he takes the place of his father Manaam, and he reigns for 2 years. From 742 to 740 BC. And during his time, one of his captains conspired against him and killed him and took his place. His name was Pekah. For 8 years, from 740 to 732 BC. And it's during this time that the Assyrians start to make their transition to take over Israel. They begin their conquest of Israel and trying to pull them into their control. And this starts when a man named Hosea, which there's debate, which I don't think holds any water. People try to say this is the same man as Hosea, which makes no sense. But anyways. This Hosea conspired against Pekah and killed him. And he became the 6th and final king during this time that Hosea ruled, or this time that Hosea was a prophet for God. Hosea reigned for 9 years, and it was under his rule that the Assyrians finally took control of the northern kingdom of Israel. And this happened because during decided that he was going to try to form an alliance with the Egyptians. And so he became buddies with the Egyptians, and the king of Assyria finds out about this. And he finds out about it because, remember back a couple of kings ago where they paid off the Assyrians year by year? Well, here during this reign of Hosea, he stopped paying that tribute. And so the Assyrians started wondering what was happening, found out that the Israelites were conspiring against them, attacking them and taking the Israelite captivity. See, here we have the 6 kings, the 6 rulers who are supposed to be leading God's people toward him. But as a result, we see there was bloodshed upon bloodshed. And we see eventually the nation of Israel being taken into captivity. we got a little bit of idea of some of the background, the history behind what's going on here during this time that Hosea is a prophet for God. But let's think for just a minute about kind of the major themes of what happens in this book. And really the major themes can be summed up into 3 words: sin, judgment, and salvation. We see this take place throughout the history, or throughout the time of Hosea. And we see this in a couple ways. And the main way that Hosea describes this cycle is through a comparison between the unfaithfulness of Gomer, his wife, and the unfaithfulness of Israel. See, throughout the book of Hosea carries out this metaphor of a marriage between God and his people. And he compares it with the marriage of Hosea and Gomer. And through this comparison, we see the major theme play out of sin, judgment, and salvation. And we see this cycle continue to go through. And during this time where we see the unfaithfulness of the nation of Israel, we see where Hosea exposes Israel's sin of idolatry. Because their unfaithfulness to God is causing them to be turned away to these false gods, these false idols, to these other things that they're putting in place of God in their lives. So Hosea exposes Israel's idolatry and their unfaithfulness through the cycle of sin, judgment, and salvation. As we begin to get into our text, I want us to, we have a very simple outline we're going to try to go through this book with. Simple and really easy to think about. I found this slide online that I really liked because I think it lays it out in a very simple way for us. The book of Hosea is split up into 2 major sections. It's split up into the first section, which is chapters 1 through 3, which deals with the unfaithful wife and the faithful husband. And here we talk about Hosea's marriage. We see this cycle take place where Gomer, Hosea's wife, is unfaithful to him. We see her discipline, then we see her restoration. And the second part of the book deals with the unfaithful people and the faithful God. Again, carrying out that metaphor of a marriage throughout the book. And here we have Hosea's message to the nation of Israel. And it's the very same idea, the very same message that we see taught in the first 3 chapters, where we see the unfaithfulness of the nation of Israel, we see the discipline of the nation of Israel, and then restoration. And then we get to the final chapter, in chapter 14, where we see this final restoration of Israel. See, this book of Hosea has a very simple outline, very straightforward. But it has a very sobering message, a very powerful message, yet a very encouraging message for us today. So let's begin. Let's get into the book of Hosea here. Let's start by looking at this first section we're going to cover this evening, where we're going to notice Gomer's unfaithfulness in the first chapter of Hosea. And it starts by talking about Hosea's marriage. Hosea chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. It says, "The word of the Lord came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. When the Lord began to speak to Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, 'Go, take yourself a wife of harlotry, and children of harlotry. For the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord.' So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son." The first 3 verses, really verses 2 and 3, we get an idea of the marriage of Hosea. And it's broken up into 2 sections that I think are very fascinating to talk about. 2 phrases that are mentioned. The first thing that's mentioned is God, in talking to Hosea, tells him to go and to take yourself a wife of harlotry. Take yourself a wife of harlotry. this is a difficult message to imagine that God would ever tell someone. When we think about the God of the Bible, usually this isn't a phrase we would expect to come out of his mouth. It doesn't make sense. And since that phrase doesn't make sense, a lot of people have tried to say that this command from God was strictly visionary or allegorical and not literal. And on surface value, when we look at this, that makes sense, and I think that's what we want to assume is the case, right? Surely God would never tell someone to go and take a wife of harlotry. God would never tell someone to go marry a prostitute. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't line up with the God that we know. Because when we understand the morality of God, there's no way that he could ever be okay with someone marrying a harlot. And he definitely wouldn't go so far as to command someone to marry one. See, this would seem to go completely against the standards of God and what we know about him from the rest of Scripture. See, we like to think that this idea of God speaking, that he's not speaking literally, because it allows us to avoid the moral difficulty of our holy God commanding someone to do something unholy. The problem with that is that when we look at the text, when we look at the account, the way it was written, it's a very straightforward account, and it doesn't seem to lend itself to any idea of this being a symbolic act. Usually when there's symbolism, there's a break where something is explained as to why this was said. But here in this account, it's very straightforward, and there's none of that, which makes it difficult for us to say that this was a non-literal command from God. With that being the case, there must be some kind of explanation then. Why would God make this command? Why is this okay for God to say it in this situation? So if we think and try to approach this as a literal command, did you want to say something? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of debate as to what exactly it means, and that could be part of it. If we're going to accept that it's a literal command by God to go and take yourself a wife of harlotry, then there has to be some kind of explanation to it. And again, people take different sides. People take different approaches to it. The debate that usually arises when we approach this from a literal command is whether or not this text is based on whether Gomer was a harlot at the time of their marriage or if it occurred after the fact. See, our English translations make it sound like God calls Hosea to seek out a woman who is actively a harlot and to marry her. But the Hebrew language seems to shine a little bit different light on this idea. See, both the language of Hosea chapter 1 and verse 2 and the context following it support the idea that the phrase wife of harlotry doesn't describe her condition at the point of marriage, but characterized what she would prove to be. The same Hebrew word that's used to translate harlotry or adulteress in some translations is used later in the book of Hosea, in Hosea chapter 4 and verse 12, and Hosea chapter 5 and verse 4 to describe the activity of Israel and their relationship with God. So it's used, again, the same word, but it's used in a way that isn't as seem to be as straightforward as what the English translation makes it sound. Because here it's dealing with the relationship that Israel has with God in a way where Israel was together, was with God, but now they are, they have a spirit of harlotry, I think is what the text says. So we understand if we look at it from the standpoint of Israel, that same word is used, and it was a people who were one with God, had a relationship with him, and then left him and became, and had a relationship with these false gods. So when we think about it from that standpoint, when we think about it from the Hebrew language, that word, then it points to this idea that maybe it's not a pointing to or talking about his actions before they were married, but maybe something that took place during the marriage. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and in that phrase, a lot of commentators talk. They suggest that's not necessarily her family, but it's the culture in that time. In that time, the children, the culture was very much that way, and so in that time period, they suggest that she was a part of a culture where that was the norm, and maybe it wasn't necessarily just her lineage, but it was the culture. It was the norm in that time. Does that make sense? I don't know which one's true. No, that's true. That's right. That's right. When we look at the context, look past a little bit in Hosea chapter 1 and verse 2, we see where it points to the unfaithfulness of both Hosea's marriage with Gomer and God's marriage with Israel, and not the premarital experience of the bride. Okay? So when we look at the Hebrew word, when we look at the context, we see where maybe it's not pointing to the fact that she was a harlot at the point that they were married, but it was, but she proved to be that. A lot of the scholars that I've been reading, they suggest that a better reading, better understanding, better interpretation of this text would be take for yourself a wife who will prove to be unfaithful. And when we think about it from that standpoint, it clears up some of the challenges that we would face by thinking about our holy God calling someone or commanding someone to do something unholy. But God's command doesn't stop there with just take yourself a wife of harlotry. He then says take children of harlotry. Take children of harlotry. In the next several verses, in chapter 1, verses 3 through 9, we see where Hosea and Gomer have 3 children. And we're going to get into them a lot because there's a lot of deep messages in what takes place with them. But what's interesting is that in verse 3, we're told that Hosea took Gomer and she conceived a son. But in verses 6 and 8, when we're told about the other 2 children, we're just told that Gomer conceived. And so some people, they try to suggest that what this is saying is that maybe the first child was a legitimate child from their marriage, but the other one were children of harlotry because they came out of the acts, the sexual acts of Gomer in her unfaithful marriage. I don't know that I'm on the same page with that. I think the phrase children of harlotry could simply point to the children being born in the context of Gomer's sin and not a direct result of it. That's what I tend to lean toward. I can't tell you that's 100% accurate, but that's what I tend to lean toward in this passage. And more than likely points to the character of Gomer and not to the children. The reason I think that is because we see similar language throughout the Old Testament. We think about Joseph. In Genesis chapter 37 and verse 3, this is what we're told of Joseph, that he was a son of his old age. I don't think that means that he was a son and was born old. That doesn't make sense. It has to deal with his parents who were born, who had a child when they were later in their years of life. And so this terminology, this phrase points more to the characteristics of the parents and not of the children. And I think the same thing holds true when we look at this idea of Hosea when God talks about his children. Take yourself children of harlotry has nothing to do with the children being born illegitimately. It has more to do with the characteristics of their mother during the time that they were born. But here's the thing. These two ideas, these two phrases are fascinating to me. And we could spend several weeks digging in and talking about the different sides, the different parts of this debate, and trying to understand exactly what it all means. But I don't think that's necessary. Here's what we need to know. We need to understand that God issued a command to Hosea, and Hosea followed through with that command. In the first 3 verses, that's the key. That's what we need to understand. Hosea had so much faith in God that even though God challenged him to do something that may seem difficult or may seem strange, he followed through with that command. In Hosea chapter 1, starting in verse 3, going through verse 9, we have a little discussion about the children of Hosea. And what I want us to do is I want us to break down the text where it deals with each of these children individually, because there's really a lot of meaning behind what takes place with each of these children. Let's start by talking about his first child in Hosea chapter 1, verses 3 through 5. It says this. It said, "So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to him, 'Call his name Jezreel, for in a little while I will avenge the bloodshed of Jezreel on the house of Jehu, and bring an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. It shall come to pass in that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel.'" Here we get a little description of the first son of Hosea and Gomer, Jezreel. Jezreel means God sows or God scatters. See, a lot of times when we have a name given by God, it's because the name has a lot of significance. The other 2 children of Hosea, when God names them, I think the meaning of their name has a lot to do with the message God has to say, but I don't know that the name has a lot of significance with this son. Jezreel, I think, has more to do with a place or a location than the significance of the name itself. In 2 Kings chapters 9 and 10, we see where Jezreel was the site of Jehu's massacre of the house of Ahab. And the reason for this punishment that Hosea prophesies about here in Hosea chapter 1, that was going to be dealt out to the house of Jehu, I don't think it had. I don't think it was necessarily because of the death that he brought to the house of Ahab. I don't think the punishment had anything to do with that necessarily. Because if you think about it, there were a lot of things that led up to the death of Ahab and his family and their great wickedness, him and Jezebel, that I think God caused to happen or led to happen. I say that because in 1 Kings chapter 21, verses 21 through 24, Elijah prophesied about the death of the house of Ahab. In 2 Kings chapter 9, verses 6 through 10, Elisha commanded that this take place. And then in 2 Kings chapter 10 and verse 30, God commended the fact that it happened. And so if God, in Hosea chapter 1, if here, when he's talking about the son Jezreel, if he begins to say, well, I'm bringing this great punishment upon you because of the death of the house of Ahab, then really God is going against what he had commended just a while back. See, I don't think it necessarily had to do with the death that came to the house of Ahab. I think it had to do with the events that led up to the point of the death of the house of Ahab. Because we know God commended this to happen. He wanted Ahab and his household to be done away with. And this happened at the hands of Jehu. But what happened leading up to the point of the massacre of the house of Ahab was several things. First off, Jehu killed Joram in 2 Kings chapter 9 and verse 24. In 2 Kings 9, 27 through 28, he killed Ahaz, the king of Judah. And then in 2 Kings 10, 12 through 14, again, just leading up to this point of the massacre of Ahaz and his household, we see where Jehu killed 42 of Ahaz's relatives. And he took advantage of the commands of God. And I think that all of these things led to this great punishment that Hosea prophesied against the house of Jehu. And what's interesting is we see the fulfillment of this prophecy because in 752 BC, a king which we talked about a little bit ago, Shallum, assassinated Zechariah. And Zechariah was the fourth descendant of Jehu who took the rule, became the king in the northern kingdom. And at the point of the death of Zechariah, the lineage, the dynasty of Jehu was broken, just as what was prophesied here in Hosea. See, when God said here in Hosea chapter 1 that I will break the bow of Israel, he was referring to the destruction of the nation's military might. And again, we see this prophecy being fulfilled in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 3 and 5, where the Assyrians overran the nation of Israel and caused them to become a small province within their own empire. See, when we think about this first child of Jezreel, we see where there is this great prophecy that took place, where we see the demise of Jehu and his household. But as we look a little further, we see a little bit about the second child. The second child, we read about in verses 6 and 7. It says, and she conceived again and bore a daughter. Then God said to him, call her name Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer have mercy on the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them out. Yet I will have mercy on the house of Judah. I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow, nor by sword, or battle, or horses, or horsemen. We're going to try to fly through some of this stuff here. Lo-Ruhamah, it means she is not loved or pitied. This word, Ruhamah, it comes from a Hebrew verb which describes a feeling of compassion, such as one that's expressed from a parent to a child. We understand when we think about God that He is a God of compassion, that He's a God of justice, But he also said in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, that he will by no means clear the guilty. While he's a God of justice, while he's a God of compassion, he's going to hold the guilty to a standard. And they may face punishment. See, while Israel was going to face great judgment from God at the hands of the Assyrians, we're told here in Hosea chapter 1 that Israel, or that Judah, would be delivered by God from the Assyrians. And this deliverance from the Assyrians was not a one where they were going to win this great military battle, but instead it was going to be one where they were going to have to trust in the providence of God. And we see this take place in 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 35 through 36, where the Assyrian army, they've taken Israel into captivity, and now they're coming up to Judah. And one night, while the nation, or the Assyrian army is asleep, God comes in, or sends the angel of the Lord, and he kills 185,000 of the Assyrian soldiers in their sleep in a silent way, so that those who were spared woke up the next morning and saw 185,000 corpses laying in their campsite. See, here we see where God no longer had the same amount of love for Israel as he once had. But he still had this great relationship with Judah. Let's think about the third child. Hosea chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. It says, "Now when she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son. Then God said, 'Call his name Lo-Ami, for you are not my people, and I will not be your God.'" See, I think this final discussion that comes from God was maybe the most difficult of them all. See, Lo-Ami means not my people. We understand that God in the Old Testament had this great covenant with his people. In Leviticus chapter 26 and verse 12, it said, "Oh, I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people." So the nation of Israel, God's people, had this great covenant with God and had a great relationship with him. And now here through this prophecy, through God calling Hosea to name his third child Lo-Ami, meaning not my people, we see where he no longer has the same relationship with him. Here's of all the things I studied for this class, here's the most fascinating thing to me. This final phrase in chapter 1 and verse 9, where it says, I will not be your God, literally reads, "I am not, I am to you." I am not, I am to you. You remember this was the same phrase that God used to Moses when he talked to him through the burning bush. He said, "When I go to Pharaoh, who do I say sent me?" He said, "I am." The same terminology is used. This phrase, "I am," points to a covenant, to God as the covenant Lord of Israel, who watches over and delivers his people. But here God announces that Israel would no longer experience this privilege of having a covenant relationship with him. Think back the life of Hosea. Think about everything he went through during this short amount of time. Have you ever thought to yourself, or maybe even asked the question, why is God punishing me or allowing these things to happen to me? Have you ever experienced a time like Hosea just did? Or here he is in this relationship with a woman who's unfaithful to him. And he's looking out and has to go to this nation who is unfaithful to God, who are no longer have a relationship with him whatsoever, where I am not, I am to them anymore. And they have to try to move forward. Hosea was a prophet in a difficult time for the nation of Israel. And we're going to get more into it next week. Thank you very much for your attention.